Exactly. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. This is kind of like old home week for some of us. And I mean, wow. I haven't seen Jen for ages. And so it's really wonderful you're all here. It's wonderful to have done this exhibition, have Christina back. She is, or I just said that there's a thing going on with the senior exhibition. And I think of Christina as a writer as much as a sculptor. And when she was in charge of the senior thesis, people actually wrote English sentences. And they were really good. Yeah. Okay.
You want to teach it in the fall?
Exactly. Nope. So Christina Shmigel is, as I mentioned, sculptor, writer. She is the only person I know who has 2 MFAs. MFA from RISD and an MFA from SIU Carbondale, and I don't know, I guess she needed more. At any rate, her work is wonderful. She's wonderful, had been a faculty member with us, as many of you know, for several years. Exhibits nationally, internationally, represented by Bruno David locally. And with that, Christina Shmigel.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for inviting me to do the show. I haven't used this type of trick in a long time. Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank you to all of you who have come. It's really great to see people. Thank you also to Sam and Lizzie and Abby who helped put the gallery together. Sam especially, the show would not be what it is without Sam's awesome job. So, thank you all for that. So one of the things that's exciting to me about this show is that 24 years ago, I had a show in the Hunt Gallery. So this is like an anniversary show in some ways. It's really thrilling to be invited to do a new show here 25 years later. And this show, the show I've done now, feels to me as much of a departure from the work I did before as this original Hunt Gallery show felt at the time. One of the things that's evolved for me in the last couple of years is I've been becoming involved in a Zen koan study practice, and I'll talk more about what that means as we go on. But that's entirely shifted my way of thinking about the way I make my work. In the same way that this original show shifted me from being an object maker to being an installation artist. So moving away from just thinking about individual objects and thinking about how does space become part of the object. So one of the things that's happened as a result of the Zen practice is I've moved away from the idea, or the place where I always thought that art comes from was from me, from inside myself. And that it evolved from, and this is the way that I worked with students, the way I thought about art making, was that it comes from that collection of experiences, histories, whatever that you have. And in working with students to develop their work, I was always thinking about, and I think about it for myself all the time, like what is the frequency that makes you the individual maker that you are? That each maker has their own particular frequency. And you know, a lot of what we do in art education is to try to help people to understand what their particular, hone down into their particular frequency. And when we're doing that, we're often really locating it inside ourselves. And then it occurred to me, because I've been talking to musician friends who were exploring the question of where does art come from, or where does music come from? They were tossing around this idea of where does music come from? And I realized that I had never thought about the idea of where does art come from other than from inside myself. And it's a really interesting question. So I'm going to pitch it out to you all for a minute or two, but I'm going to, just to give it a frame, and some of you know this story, really great story, where the musician Tom Waits is driving along in his car, and the muse comes and she's got a song for him. And at one point as a younger musician, he would have like dropped anything. He was running out of time to write down songs. Anytime that the calling came, he was on it. But now he's a kind of more mature musician. He's been through this experience a lot of times. He realizes that it's not the last song that's going to come to him, and that he does not have to pull off the highway to write it down. And so he says to the muse, go bother somebody else. Go give it to Leonard Cohen. Which is an interesting to think about what Leonard Cohen would do with the Tom Waits song. But that's a different question. So, yeah, so I'm just, like a word or two, if any of you have a reaction to that, outside of within yourself, where do you think of his art coming from?
I would say other artists. Like constantly looking at art history and other contemporary artists who inspire me.
Yeah. Doesn't it come from everywhere?
That's
That's an answer.
It comes from nowhere, too.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was into, like, what doesn't it come from, really? And then to add on to what you said, like, thinking about, like, art history, cultures, things like that. For me, it's like, where doesn't it come from?
Anybody else?
It's a virus.
It's
It's a virus.
Oh, it's a virus. It's a virus.
Well, I just think of it as like art being the lens that like everything in the world like filters through and it comes out. Right? So it's not coming from us necessarily, but we're the sifter.
Yes, I'm interested in your gesture about
Yeah,
it.
I'm
Because
just thinking of like a sifter funnel or something.
yeah, so one of the things that has changed for me in my own practice is positioning the art outside of myself. So with that, in a way that I don't have to be responsible for the art, which I have a lot of creative anxiety. I get into the studio and I get very anxious. The critical voices start flying. Existential crisis in the studio keeps me from working, even though I know it's the place I want to be, and yet I can't be there. And so this question about where the art comes from, the record producer Rick Rubin's written a really great book called, what's it called?
What is it called?
The Creative Way, I think. And the creative act, a way of being. And he's worked with lots of music talent over the years, and has really thought about this question. And he thinks of it as the source, and that it's kind of out there, kind of in that same gesture, that it's kind of out there, and that you tune into it. And then recently I heard a fantastic interview with musician Jean-Baptiste. He's done a new album in which he collaborates with Beethoven, because he hears in Beethoven the sound of spirituals from West Africa. And this is so much more complicated music theory than I can begin to tell you, but he hears it, and now he's collaborating with Beethoven. And so the way he described this experience is really amazing to me. The themes Beethoven was able to manifest were all sitting right there, pre-written by the divine source of the creator. It's just sitting right there in the divine stream of consciousness, waiting for someone to pull it down. And Beethoven was the vessel for so many of those things that we all feel and we all want to hear, but nobody has played yet. That feeling is connected to the human condition. It's the human condition made into sound. I love that. Human condition made into sound. And in the responses that you all were making, it's the human condition made into art, is what we're doing. And by having that perspective, it means that I don't have to be in charge in the studio. I can be open in a way that takes a lot of that creative pressure off of me. So I can do something, look at it, think, I don't know about that. If it were up to me, I wouldn't do it that way. But I think, well, whatever is, there's a generative force that's out there. Wanted it this way, so let's see what happens based on its impulse to do this thing. So it's a huge shift for me to be thinking this way, and the show that you'll see in the Hunt Gallery comes very directly out of that change of perspective.
Wow.
So part of the change has also required kind of a change in where I position the work. So for 25 years, I've been making, or 30 years longer, I've been working based on place. So depending on the place where I'm living, I'm drawing images, experiences from that place to make the work. And so it started really primarily in Southwest Louisiana when I was teaching there. It's a very flat place, and mostly what you see when you're in the car is way out on the distance, you'll see a water tower. And in the landscape, they had the experience of being quite lonely because it's a singular structure in the middle of nothingness. And yet, in actuality, a water tower is connected to community because it's the water that runs into the pipes of everybody in that community. So it's both a marker of place and it carries a kind of, I mean, we all know it from images and songs and whatever, it has kind of lonesome feeling to it. And that's very often was the response people had to it, was either the work was melancholy, or they would start to see things they hadn't seen before. They'd be like, hey, did you know that Ray, Louisiana has 3 water towers? It's like, yep, I do that. So it's such a potent image for me that I do return to it. So this is a much more recent version of the water tower idea. This was in a window at Bruno David's gallery just pre-COVID. And in St. Louis, when I moved here, what really struck me was the kind of agro-industrial architecture of St. Louis. So mostly what I'm attracted to in the landscape is the things that other people don't want to see, the overlooked, you know, what's thought of as like the ugly part of the landscape, or it's so common, like in this example of the 3 water towers, it's so common that people no longer see it. And so this is a form you may or may not recognize, is often on tops of like wood shops and places like that. It pulls the particle pollutants out of the air. And so I started building these structures with it. So this is terrible old slides from the show at Hunt Gallery in 2001. And so it marked a real change in my work because I went from the object-oriented pieces of the water tower to thinking about the entire space as the event and how to move the viewer through the space in such a way that they weren't just looking at the object, but they're actually physically experiencing something as they move through the space. So, you know, something might show or not show through that window as they moved around. They might see this pipe on one side of the wall and see something else that continues it through. And so it became an experiential way of dealing with sculpture rather than just as an object maker. Here's another version of that same work. This is a slew in a utility closet, which is one of my favorite places I've ever worked. It's such a great venue. And it was the kind of the beginning, in some ways, the beginning of introducing objects that make a question, like, wait, is that supposed to be there? Like, that's an extension cord. Did she just put that in? She couldn't think of anything else to do. And so I wanted that tension between what's real in the world and what's not real in the world, and maybe it serves both purposes at the same time. So then everything changed because we moved to Shanghai, China. And again, a question of how to make work based on the place where you are. Except now the place was so foreign, there was so much to draw from, that it was really hard to know what to make. And the other piece of it was that at that time, it's not true anymore in Shanghai, but at that time, there was no opportunity for installation work. There was no venues that did installation, particularly in Shanghai. It was a very commercial art market. So there was no idea about installation work. And there was also no interest in foreign artists. Like the Chinese art market was just opening, so that's where they were interested. So I had to come up with another way of thinking about sight that wasn't about a room. And so one of the first manifestations of that was a series of hat projects. You know, the site as the head is the site, and then how does the body moving through space with that hat on it change the space? So this is a direct translation of the building that was in scaffolding. All of Shanghai looked like that. At one point I had put it all over our inside our living room. So it was a way of kind of like bringing the outside world into the inside world. Eventually I acquired this Chinese medicines cabinet. It's a massive thing. It has 64 drawers plus the 3 across the bottom, and then each one of those drawers is divided into 4 little arches. And so the use of it is for traditional Chinese medicine, and the characters you see on the faces of the drawers, those are the names of the 4 medicines that would be in that drawer, and they usually, they're connected to each other, so they might be all intestinal treatment or menstrual. Or so here you have more of a sense of what it looks like on the inside, like compartments on the inside. And so again, it offered itself up as a site in a time when there was no site to work with. Except it's a very difficult site because it's about 4.5 by 4 inches square and 5 inches deep, which is not a happy site to work into. So it was a real challenge in terms of thinking about how to negotiate that.
What year was this, Christina?
It's a very long project. I think I worked on it for about 5 years, so it maybe started in 2006 to 2012 or something like that. So like with the water towers and the architecture in St. Louis, I'm interested in the thing that's visible, but really I'm talking about something invisible that lives inside that thing. So in picking the objects that went into the drawers, I was looking around at what the material culture of Shanghai was like at that time. And I was selecting those things that seemed to me that not only were they kind of a cool object as a physical thing, but they usually had some connection to some cultural aspect that was so embedded in the society that people might not even be thinking about it as significant culturally. So this is one row of drawers with all of their compartments to give you a sense of what the whole, like you got to open a whole row. These were mops that were made, you bought them in every market, and they're made out of t-shirts. They're completely useless as mops. T-shirts are not really an absorbent material, but they were really beautiful as graphic design objects. A kind of pink plastic string that was completely ubiquitous. These were great. They're arm protectors. So when you're working in a messy and dirty situation, and you wanted to protect, or sleeve protectors, so if you wanted to keep your shirt from getting dirty, you put these on, and it was always incredibly decorative. This was the very first object that went into the medicine cabinet. It was when you were coming in, you might have noticed the same plastic bottle as part of the hat that I was wearing in that slide. It was the dishwashing, the single dishwashing liquid that was available in Shanghai at that time. It's called White Cat. And if you look at it, it's kind of really neat, kind of a weird and it was the trigger really for doing this project, because I thought this kind of object is going to disappear from this culture very soon. Like the kind of advertising that we have, the slickness of design of advertising, it's coming. Like this is the very beginning of fashion magazines showing up in Shanghai. Up until in that time, there hadn't been slick magazines. So the change was coming, and I knew that these kinds of objects were going to disappear. And so that was part of the other part of the collecting, was what were the things that were so present in the culture, that was so kind of definitive there in a way that nobody thought about if they were from there, but that they were likely to disappear. This is, let's see that's that little object. And then some things that I put in there were things that were completely intangible, and I was trying to hold on to some particular moment, and then they don't read that way to anybody else, but for me they were kind of memento mori of a particular time. So this is a recreation model of a particular window that I saw one time. I was on the elevated highway in Shanghai, which is like 4 stories up high, so it's going along the attic line and the houses that are alongside it, in a neighborhood where the buildings are being torn down so they can put up skyscrapers. And a woman leaned out of this window and she had a row of plants in front. And there's just all this cacophony of the highway, the construction, everything around her is just completely in chaos. And she's very carefully and quietly tending to these little plants. And there was something about this relationship with these greens and her plants and the quietude with which she was present, the kind of the silence she had in that context, that made me want to hold on to that.
Is this piece interactive? Can you open it,
Yes.
or do you open or just?
No, it's intended to, whenever I show it, people are allowed to, and I have to say that kind of miraculous, I've shown it quite a few times, and it's been in shows for like 3 months at a time. Only once has something been stolen. And that was kind of instructive, actually it was quite instructive, because the thing that got stolen, my husband was going back to Shanghai and knew exactly where I had bought that thing. And he said to go to the store and get the rack. It was hard sumi inks, and it had a rack image on it for the year of the rat. And so I said to him, oh, go to that place and get me a replacement of his. And he went in, and this is probably about 10 years later, and shows it to the guy, and the guy's like, old fashioned, we haven't made those for years. And so it reconfirmed that like I was actually holding on to things that were getting lost. So it was working on you'll see in a little while, I was working on a film with a Chinese, young Chinese woman who was living in the States. She was at WashU, and we were working on a film. And we had a great experience working on this film, and I said to her, oh, I have this project that I did, it would be so great for us to make a film where you open all the drawers and you talk about all the things that are in the drawers, because it's much more interesting from your perspective than from mine. You know what the things are. And of course, when I show this in our context, people mostly don't know what these things are. So I thought it would be fun to make a film where this is kind of return engagement. I engage with the culture, and then somebody reflecting that back to me. I thought it would be interesting. So we started talking about it, and as it turned out, both her grandparents had been Chinese medicines doctors, so she actually understood the text. She knew what some of the drawers were cures for. So that was really fun. But then we started opening up the drawers, and this one, this is the gold joss that they burned for the dead. It's meant to be money as opposed to your ancestors. And when we lived in a very historic part of historic, like nobody in our neighborhood was under 90 years old.
We're the kids.
So they had maintained a lot of traditions that the Cultural Revolution and modernism and all kinds of things had knocked out of the culture. And so I showed her this, and I said to her, oh, it's about the ghost circles. And she says, what are the ghost circles? And I'm like, that time of year when people could draw the chalk circles on the ground and they burn the joss in the middle. And she's like, what are you talking about? I'm like, yeah, you must know this, because it happened all the time in our neighborhood. Well, it turned out that she was a grade school student at that point. She was living in a high-rise in a very modern part of the city. Her parents had decidedly rejected what was then referred to as feudal Chinese culture, and wanted to live in the modern world. So she had missed all of this. She didn't know anything about it. So here I'm the foreigner explaining to her about ghost circles. It was crazy. This is another kind of ephemeral thing that's in the drawers, which you'll recognize when you go see the show. One of the distinctive, again, one of these things that made Shanghai, it's not visible much anymore, was that everybody hung their laundry out on lines. And entire streets were hung with laundry like banners. And the shadows would be remarkable. So this was a recording of that kind of. It created an incredible intimacy. You're in this huge city, and you have this great intimacy because your neighbors have their red underwear out for the new year. And so, you didn't even know them, but you knew something about them. So it was always very touching to me about the laundry. But actually, the Chinese government really frowned on it. It was actually illegal to hang your laundry up in this kind of way. People did it anyway. My great heroes of Shanghai were the recycling people who would cart everything away. And the structures that they would build on the back of these 3-wheeled carts were mind-boggling to me. And as a sculptor, I was always like trying to figure out how do they do that. So the transition from Shanghai to St. Louis. So, you know, as I said, I was always working one place, but I'm moving back to St. Louis. Am I going to go back and make work that I made 14 years earlier? Like, what do I make now? Like, how do I see St. Louis in any way that's interesting to me anymore? And I had stopped working in steel, which I'd worked with previously, so I was kind of going to be stuck for what it was that I was going to make. And so as a way to kind of make the transition from the Chinese life to the American life, we saved all the cardboard boxes that moved us from Shanghai to St. Louis, were undone and were piled this high in the basement. And then I started using a laser cutter to cut them into these modules. And then the modules began to grow into this city that kind of mimics the brutalist architecture of Shanghai. But the thing that really, this was sort of almost a byproduct, because the real intention was to make one of those recycling carts. And so here's the little video that did it for us. Do I have to do something different?
You should just press it again.
Whoops. Yes. It's about 3 minutes.
Oh, is it gonna have the sound?
You gotta connect it to requester, you have to go to sound.
Yeah, what you got?
It's a setting on that.
It's a setting on her map?
Yeah. You gotta go to systems.
Yep.
Yeah, you have to go to systems.
Sorry.
I think you gotta connect, see, because I work on it, you have to connect
Oh,
your
right. I
map
know what
to
you're
this
talking about.
system. Go to your system folder. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
system,
And then
sound.
sound, yeah. That one. Yeah. And that one, yeah, thanks, Karen, that should do it. Then you can click out and just click play again. No,
You're on play.
you were, go down to where it says play on.
I'm right above the black square on the left top. All right, now.
Yeah, go up.
All right,
Onto the bar, onto the bar.
to the left.
Don't work. There it is. Play, you got it? Yeah. Press it one more time.
My husband and I moved to Shanghai in 2004. One of the most remarkable sights I saw there was the recycling haulers. They'd secure these massive loads onto their bicycles or their three-wheeled carts. Yeah. One of my favorite things with the recycling people I ever saw was, so the man is driving the bicycle. They have a huge load of cardboard. It's like way, way higher than his head. Okay. His wife is in the back pushing it from behind. Their kid is sitting at the very top of the pile with a microwave. All three of them are like beaming.
Now I'm thinking head injury.
I think it just makes me admire them even more than I did already. When I would look at what they were doing, I would think, like, how do they know how to balance those things? Whoa! How much stuff did I put on my bicycle and still ride around? Oh, that is cool.
Really difficult to maintain any sort of control. I was trying to get a nice little orbit around you and fight the wind.
and they build these kind of geometric, they're beautiful. And so in Ukrainian, these are called pavuk, a spider. And the whole time that I was making that thing, I had to keep thinking about how to give it stability, how to balance it, but I didn't want it to look too perfect. I wanted it to keep the quality of chaos that I would see in Shanghai.
What's the hardest part of it?
Getting it to balance.
I kind of feel like tighten it all up.
That was hard too. Family's history that I think has always informed the work because they're immigrants. And it's my experience, it's my moving boxes, so it's me changing my context, trying to understand how to be burdens that we all carry as human beings, like as we move around and try to figure out what we're doing with our lives. We're breaking through!
That was the culmination of the Shanghai work, was the mobile recycling. One of my favorite moments making that piece was at some point, it's all tied down with the pink string I pointed out inside the cabinet earlier. So it's all tied down to keep it in place with that. And at some point I went over to it and I pulled on the string to see if it was taut enough. And I remembered I'd seen that gesture like 1,000 times in Shanghai where somebody else was tying something down. And it had never really occurred to me what they were doing. But when I did it with my own body, it was like, oh, that's what they were doing. They were checking to see whether that thing was going to fall over or not. So it's this wonderful moment of like being out of my own body and somebody else's. So the dilemma was what to do now that I need new subject matter. What am I going to make in St. Louis? And I began to make these are on circulars. So that was something that struck me that I hadn't. I now lived in the suburbs where before I had lived in the city, and I'm getting these circulars for the groceries all the time. And I'm thinking, what a waste of paper. And so I started painting on them just as a way to use them for something. And was talking to a friend of mine about the idea of yellow. And he told me a story about how a student of his had mixed 15 yellows, and then a visiting critic came in, and the student was really chuffed, 15 yellows. And the visiting critic was like, 15? Show me 75 and I'll be impressed. And I was like, 75 yellows? What does that mean? Like, I'm going to try that. So we started with yellow. And then this little drawing happened. This is on one of those small Google pads. It was much bigger on this slide. And it came through a kind of a thought experiment I was doing with somebody. And I was really struck by it as a drawing. It really satisfied me as a drawing. But I knew that it wasn't the image. It was the fact that it was on the legal paper material that was what made that interesting. And so I began to make my own giant pieces of legal paper. So these are sheets of New York Times. This is like the spread from New York Times, painted with yellow, lined with green pen and red pen. It doesn't show up in the slide very well. And then the drawings are done on top, and they're double-sided, so there's legal paper-looking stuff on both sides. And so there's two things that are in there. One is the dailiness of the paper. Something happens every day. And then the legal paper, it's scrap. Like, you don't use legal paper to write your novel on. You use it because you're jotting something down, you're in a meeting. So it's also ordinary time, and it's ephemeral. You don't tend to hold on to the things that you do on legal paper. So those were two questions of time. The next one was drawing all these little lines. So hours of sitting there just making that mark over and over and over again. So then time becomes something different because it's how I'm using my time, how I'm wasting my time or spending my time. And it takes, the photograph is of the drawing in midstream to show you just how the layers of it happen over time. So it takes layers and layers of the drawing to get to the depth of color I might be looking for. And then the drawing seems done, as much as they get done, when another kind of time comes into it. So, and it's a time that's kind of the time that's timeless, that when you're looking into something, it becomes spatial in a way that time seems to be infinite. So we're moving from like the daily temporal time to a kind of vastness of time. And it was about this, it was around when I started these drawings that I became involved with studying the Zen koans. And most of you have heard at least one koan, which is the famous one, which is what is the sound of one hand clapping, or often more kind of accurately translated is what's the sound of one hand. And the koans, they come out of the, we call it the Zen Buddhist tradition, but Zen is actually the Japanese name for this tradition, and Chan is the Chinese name. This tradition actually originates in China, in Chan Buddhism. When Buddhism and Taoism encounter each other, these teachings come into being. It's kind of 8th to 12th century China. And the nature of a koan is that sometimes it's a story, sometimes it's a dialogue, and it's always paradoxical. And there is no answer in the logical sense. So it's not a riddle. You can't figure it out. That's the whole point of that, is to trip you out of your logical mind, the mind that tries to explain everything all the time, centers itself in me knows the answer to this situation, and puts it out there. So the koan that hooked me was one that I think, the experience of which I think all of us as artists know. So the head monk says, bring me the rhinoceros fan. And the young monk says, oh, it's broken. And the old monk says, bring me the rhinoceros. And when I first heard that, I thought, this is completely fucking absurd. Like, what's that supposed to mean? And yet I was totally hooked. Like, I was like, what is it supposed to mean? And that's the way koans are meant to work. They're not meant to, for you to inhabit them rather than for you to understand them in an explanatory sort of way. And I think the reason I say you all know that, because I think that's part of the art experience. You know, you go into the studio, you're going to make X, you get in there, you're making X, and suddenly you don't have the thing you need, or that thing broke, or, well, it's not working anyway, and so then you make a rhinoceros instead of making a rhinoceros fan. So I think a lot of what that koan is about is the flexibility of mind, to not be attached to the destination, but to accept whatever comes along on the way to the destination. So there were lots of thinking about Eastern ways of experiencing the world. This one is I am the field, and I am the knower of the field. It was one of the early drawings. That experience of like, who am I, and who's that other voice inside me who's talking about who I am, and who's the voice behind that. So the I that I know, and then the I that knows something more than what I myself know. And a lot of the drawings, they're related to the koans, but they aren't illustrations of the koans. So when I'm working on one of these drawings, I'm not necessarily thinking, oh, it's this koan that I'm addressing. What I'm interested in, and this is the way my practice with the koans is that they just open up a space. There's no answer in them. So I'm just sitting in some space that they created. And that space lets me step away from myself into something more open. And when I'm drawing, that's the space I get to sit in. And it's not like I'm meditating when I'm drawing. I might be listening to podcasts, I might be listening to music. But there's something about entering into it that's different than when I was working before, which is why I was saying that this feels like a entirely new way of working. So the koans they do different kinds of things, but some of them are predicament koans. So one of my favorite predicament koans starts with something like, you're hanging from a branch by your teeth. I think this is the Wile E. Coyote koan. Hanging from a branch by your teeth. And somebody down on the ground comes And they ask you a question, and it's your duty to answer their question. But if you answer their question, so how do you sit in that predicament? And one of my, this is one of my very favorite ones, but I always have to read it because they always screw it up. In a well that has not been dug, water ripples from a source that does not flow. Someone, without shadow or form, is drawing water from the well. And that's that space. It's just sitting in the silence of that space where everything is what it is and everything is not what it is at the same time, which creates a kind of spaciousness. And I think of that spaciousness as a kind of generative space, going back to the question of where does art come from. So it's not religious, I'm not a Buddhist, but I'm looking for that space of silence and openness in order to work. So I thought I'd throw up a couple of slides from, just a few slides of people who are important to me as an artist because they give me permission to do what I do. Richard Tuttle, who's like the king of audacity. Like anytime I'm in the studio and I'm thinking, oh, I can't do that, I think of Richard Tuttle on my shoulder going, you can do it. So this particular piece, which you'll see in the show, this was actually the pattern for another piece in the show. And I had just made it as a pattern. So I wasn't thinking at all about what I was doing except to get the pattern made. And I put it up on the wall and I thought, dang, that's got more aliveness to it than almost anything else I've made. So Richard Tuttle said I could put it actually. Leonard Drew, who's just an amazing, amazing artist. He makes all this stuff. Like, this is not trash that he finds. He spends hours and hours and hours painting, burning, putting it out in the landscape so it rots in order to build this material that he's making. And then he installs it in a way that makes it look like it happened like that. And so that question of duration is really interesting to me. And also the reuse. He very often pulls this show down, this show goes away entirely, and that just becomes material for something that happens later on. And that's always been the kind of thing that I've done. I've never seemed to have made work that stays in a fixed form. It always gets folderized for some other piece. So in this particular show, you'll see these little wire structures in the show. This was their first incarnation at Longmire Sculpture Park, where they were dark. The next time they were painted fluorescent. And that rock will be familiar to you too when you see the show. It's actually a well rock. It's a fiberglass rock. And here are both those objects in the show that's in the Hunt Gallery. So repurposing. And then my hero of heroes, Philida Barlow, unfortunately recently passed away. There's a great video of Philida on Art21, which is in the studio, and she's working on an object like this, but it's table size. And she's kind of pushing at it. She clearly doesn't like it. And then she looks at the guy who's taking the video and she rolls it off the table. And you can see him go, and she's like, well, something had to happen to it. It wasn't doing anything. So something had to happen to it. And to me, that's again, where does art come from? That generative moment in which she's asking something outside of herself to collaborate with her, that she can arrive at something more interesting than her own limitations as an artist, as a person, are going to let happen. And I'm not nearly as brave as Philida, but there are moments in the show where that sort of thing happens when these papers are a little bit brittle, especially in the beginning when I start working with them. And so they tear. And so this kind of mending has come to be part of the work. And it's actually my favorite thing about the work, so that like as soon as I tear one, I'm like, oh yes, it's like great. So if you don't find anything else in the show to do, you can do like a Where's Waldo in the show and go around and see all the places where the methods in it. And this is a scene from the show. The Post-it notes, I have to give a disclaimer, the Post-it notes are all very wise, and they're not me. Like I didn't write those posts. I just wrote them down. Some of them are koans, some of them are things about koan practice or about from the writings of the Shan masters. And one of my strategies for this show, and again, this is where I feel like what makes this different from what I've done before, is that I didn't close the show down. Like, there's this thing that happens a lot, I think, in studio practice, like you're working in your studio, and then it's time for the show, you put the frame on, and you put the mat around it, and you put the pedestal underneath, and you put it in the white box, and it's like you're sucking the soul out of that thing. Like, by the time you walk into the gallery, and you think, oh, that's nice work, but you can't feel the energy behind it sometimes. And then you walk into an artist's studio, and it's like insane in there, and the half-finished projects and whatever, and you can really feel the life of the work and the life of the person who's making it. And so it was my ambition with this show to try to keep some of that aliveness of the studio in the installation. So yesterday, our own Zen master, Tom Lang, saw it and said, it raises the questions without the answers. Okay, I did it. All right. And I think I'll let you go at this point. I don't think we have time for Q. I'm glad to stay if anybody wants to ask questions. And dumb questions are great. Like, what pen did you do that with? How long did it take you? I love dumb questions.
Are all the pieces on newsprint, like you said, they were, like, in the beginning of the project,
Yeah, so all these suspended drawings, it's all New York Times, which has changed its format. It used to be more square. So the older drawings are on a more square, and then the newer drawings are on a slightly more rectangular. I was very disappointed to discover that when I found out the other day. Oh, yeah.
What was your favorite art piece that you put in the gallery so far? What was your most
It might be that rock that I showed earlier, that paper cutout of the rock, because I think it has a freshness that, and I think the freshness comes from that I had no mission when I was making it except to solve the problem. So in a way, I think it comes from the most authentic place within oneself. I was completely unself-conscious in solving the problem. I just was solving the problem. Where, if I had been careful about it, or I had thought, I'll make those lines all match each other, it would have been a very different thing. So I think I really, it feels like a guide in some way to keep the spirit of that as part of how I'm working.
So you're on the elevator, highway, and you're driving, right? Or
No, I'm in a taxi.
You're a taxi, okay. And so you can look out the window.
Yes. I only have a flip phone. This is like so long ago that I've only got a flip phone.
Okay, so what I'm interested in is like going back to the Tom White story and your muse. What do you do? I mean, you obviously saw that, and you saw something in the woman in the window, right? Talk about the process of your muse and how you work with that. What
That's
you
a
do
great
with
question.
that.
Yeah, because that's something I have started thinking about. Like when I thought that I didn't have that approach of thinking that I take it from, that it's out there and I'm reaching for it. And then when I switched the way I thought about it, that's exactly it. And I think that's the thing I said earlier about frequency that I think everybody has, is that you, for whatever reasons of who you are, tune into something that is available to you from wherever in that moment. Annie Dillard has this great thing she says about writing, that if there's like some particular creepy crawly insect that only you care about, then it's your job to write about it. Because only you can bring it out into the world and make other people see it. And that could be the muse. Could be thought of as the muse. I mean, we usually think of a muse as a beautiful woman standing next to a grumpy painter guy, but maybe the bug is your muse. Maybe that's the generative energy of the universe saying, yeah, this is yours. Like, you do something else.
Did you have that thought what was your thought process when?
I just
was it
never
an
thought
afterthought, or?
I hold on to those things. I see them and I hold on to them. They live in me in some kind of way. And then at some point I think, oh, I need to take this from inside myself and put it, make it real in the world. A lot of times I just do the scale too, you know, taking it from something of this scale to this scale so they can sort of hold on to it. And other work that you'll see in the show involves cans, like the cans the food comes in. And who knows why they call to me, they're cans. But for some reason, they have that, they're amused. They like, I look at them and they want me to do something with them. Anybody else?
I think this is really
Yeah.
good.
So you had mentioned like kind of getting used to the difference of moving from Shanghai to St. Louis. Have you ever thought about making a piece combining like the experiences of living in both of those and maybe like the difference or similarities between the two?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think I have. I think the experience of China was pretty intense, and I think I was pretty glad to leave it behind. and also I had done that work, you know, so I worked there we were there for like 13 years. And because of the way that culture was and me trying to make sense of that culture, it felt like the work I was making there was really anthropological in a way. It didn't feel deeply personal in a strange way. I mean, there was a long time where I was kind of almost questioning, like, am I still an artist, even though I was making things, because I just didn't have that same sense of it coming from somewhere other than my thinking. So it would be interesting to see if that could be spanned, because it's like I kind of am rejecting that very thinky way of working and trying not to know what it is I'm thinking about when I'm working, as opposed to being like, oh, and then I'll do this with this. So, yeah.
I hope you all come this evening to the opening. 6 o'clock at the gallery. It'll be good. Christina, thank you.
Thank you.